One Saturday in October of 1966, 17-year-old Norma Sims babysat for a family who was at the Florida State game in Tallahassee, Florida. When the game ended and their family got back, Norma said her goodbyes and headed home. But when she got there, it didn't seem like anyone was home. The TV was still on, but no one was on the couch watching it. Norma called out for her parents and younger sister, but no one answered. So she started to walk through the house, trying to figure out where her family was. And when she made it to her parents' room, she found them, but it wasn't a pretty scene. Norma saw her 42-year-old father, Robert, lying on the bed. As Norma looked around the room, she found her youngest sister, Joy. There was one other daughter in the Sims family, 15-year-old Judith Ann. Reports say she was out that night, and it's not clear where, but the bottom line is she wasn't home and thankfully didn't meet her demise as well. After discovering her family members in such a horrific state, Norma went to the family rotary phone and called for help. Gosh, that had to be such a nightmare for Norma. It's one thing to find one family member like that, but 3? What an unbearable loss. Norma first called a man named Russell. He owned an ambulance service as well as a funeral home. Anyway, Russell and his 16-year-old son Rocky were the first to arrive at the home. When they got there, Russell immediately started trying to save Robert and Helen, who were still alive at that point. But he didn't know whether or not the assailant was still there, so he turned off the lights and asked Rocky to go grab something to cut the ties off of their limbs. Rocky recalled, "I went into the kitchen to find a butcher knife or something, and it suddenly dawned on me that I'm here by myself. I'm not the bravest person in the world, but it scared the hell out of me, to tell you the truth." Yeah, I would be scared too. By the time Rocky was able to find a tool to free the parents, Robert was gone for good. Helen, however, was still hanging on. She was rushed to the hospital for medical attention, but things didn't look very promising. As the cops arrived, they started to investigate the scene, but a bunch of friends, neighbors, and family members came and went from the home, so it was hard to collect and determine anything from the evidence. Since there were no signs of a break-in or the Sims' valuables being stolen, detectives ruled out robbery early on. The detective claimed there were no signs of intimate physical, but later reports mentioned that there may have been evidence of a man forcing himself on Joy. Officials spoke with a neighbor who reported hearing screaming around 10:45 that night, but the neighbor didn't initially report it to the cops, assuming the noise was just from some teens messing around. I feel like the screams of teens messing around and 2 adults and 1 kid being attacked would sound much different. Anyone else? Anyway, investigators searched the home, the surrounding area, and even drained a pond in search of evidence. They apparently lifted 1,000 fingerprints from the scene, and none of them ended up leading to a suspect. The only real facts known about the case were the state of the victims' bodies and the weapons, a firearm and a blade. When Helen made it to the hospital, she was put on a respirator and fell into a coma. Sadly, she never regained consciousness and passed away after spending 9 days in the hospital. So that meant there were no surviving victims to give any information about the crime or the perp. The lead investigator assigned to this case was a 24-year-old man named Larry Campbell. That's a lot of pressure for a 24-year-old. Dang. As Larry and his team began tossing out suspect ideas, the people of Tallahassee were in a state of panic. This crime is recognized as the point where the town lost its innocence. After the Sim slayings, people started to lock their doors, prohibit their kids from playing outside at night, they bought a bunch of protective weapons and locks, women signed up for judo classes, and Halloween was pretty much canceled. Reports say that women in the area were buying water guns and filling them with ammonia for protection. Which is the first I've heard of that, but it's actually pretty smart. The funeral director's son, Rocky, said, "We just woke up one morning in Tallahassee and we were part of an evil world. It's disturbing to go to sleep knowing someone is still out there." At this point, investigators were fairly certain the perp had to know the Sims. This is because there were no signs of forced entry and the whole scene was very gruesome, like someone was out to get the Sims family. But the detectives found no reason for people to hate them. They didn't really have any dirt on them that would make someone want to snuff them. One of the Sims' neighbors said they were the nicest family I ever knew. Even still, some sick person out there did this. According to a former assistant state attorney, everything indicated that the crime had been planned and that the perp used specialized granny knots to tie up the Sims. They also spent a significant amount of time cleaning the scene, which led officials to believe the bad guy was someone who would feel comfortable being seen in the neighborhood without raising suspicion. You know who could walk around town at night without seeming suspicious? The local pastor. Yep, that's right. One of the main suspects was C.A. Roberts, the pastor of the First Baptist Church where Helen worked as a secretary. The whole family was very involved at the church too. So a few days before the incident, Helen resigned from her position, which brings up 2 theories for me. One, that Helen had a bad experience with a pastor, like maybe she knew about a scandal or maybe he even tried to make a move on her. Or 2, that Helen left for her own reasons and C.A. got so mad that he went after her and her family. That one seems way too extreme though. I feel like a man of the Lord wouldn't typically do something like that. But there are rumors that the pastor was a huge womanizer and may have had an affair or two, so Helen could have found out and threatened to out him. That seems like a believable scenario because I'm sure CA wouldn't want to ruin his reputation. But at the cost of 3 lives though, it's still a stretch. Well, CA was apparently the team chaplain for Florida State and claimed to be at the football game that night. Multiple people reported seeing him giving the pastor a pretty solid alibi. I don't know, I still feel like there could be some bribery involved. Like, if CA went up to some members of the church congregation and asked them to say he was at the game, they'd probably do it for some brownie points for the Heavenly Father. But a few months after his innocence was backed up with an alibi, CA stepped down as a pastor. Locals say the pastor's decision to resign is still a sensitive subject to this day. Yeah, that seems real shady. Detective Larry, however, never thought CA was the criminal. He believed the crime was carried out by a pair of perps, a 19-year-old woman named Mary and her 21-year-old boyfriend Vernon. Mary was often described as odd and having a reputation for being obsessed with the departed. So much so that she had been caught multiple times trying to break into funeral homes. Okay, that is just spooky. Vernon, on the other hand, was known for being a loner and a peeping Tom. It is rumored that he was peeping on Joy a week before the incident. And this would make sense with the theory that Joy was physically violated. Mary and Vernon were both interviewed, but their statements didn't quite match up. But even though Larry and the other detectives were suspicious of the couple, they were unable to find any evidence to back up their belief. So years passed and the case remained stagnant. In the 1980s, Mary reached out to investigators. She told them she thought Vernon, who was now her husband, was responsible for the slayings. And she still married him? She described it almost as if it were a dream, and a lot of people were suspicious of Mary coming forward all of a sudden, especially since she was all nosy about the reward money. And Vernon has maintained his innocence, even commenting about the case online and speaking about it in a documentary. So the documentary was made in 2016 by Florida State senior Kyle Jones. Living in Tallahassee, Kyle knew a lot about the tragedy and decided to present information about the case, the effects it had and still has on the community, and maybe even find more answers 50 years later. Kyle teamed up with a few of his classmates and began searching through police records to see what they could find. He filmed a few interviews, including one with Vernon. Kyle said, "That was a very, very interesting interview with very interesting material." He said Vernon has a lot he wants to say. The fact that the only word Kyle could use to describe Vernon's interview was interesting makes me think Kyle is suspicious of him as well. You probably don't want to say anything bad about the guy though, because that would put a target on his back for sure. Anyway, the documentary is called 641 Muriel Court, which was the Sims' home address. It is now available to watch for free on Vimeo. The same year this documentary came out, something quite concerning happened in the case. Jeremy Mutz, the state prosecutor on the case, was fired. He had been on the case since 2003 and was heavily invested. Some say he was too invested to the point of obsession. According to State Attorney Willie Meggs, Jeremy was working on a book about the Tallahassee slangs, and he was abusing his position by accessing case information to use in his book. It was reported that Jeremy was inappropriately contacting the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and personally reaching out to witnesses. Willie said there were details about the case that were private and needed to stay that way. Jeremy would be violating so many rules and protocols by sharing that information, so he had to be let go. Despite the allegations, Jeremy, who is a published writer, said he wasn't writing a book about the case, but he did say there was ample evidence to make an arrest, but claimed politics were getting in the way. He stated, "I was fired because Mr. Meggs wanted to provide political cover, I believe, for Sheriff Wood." To that, Sheriff Wood said that was probably one of the most ridiculous things I've heard in some time. This case has been in the forefront of this community for literally 50 years. It's been investigated and reinvestigated and reviewed and re-reviewed. You know, if all these sheriffs and attorneys set their differences aside and stop being petty, they might actually make advances in the case. Gosh, this is reminding me of high school, a place I never want to be reminded of. Sometime around 2018, a blog post was published on the now taken down site ididitforjody.com. In the post, it is said that the blogger made a convincing case that Detective Larry missed an opportunity to get a confession from Mary and Vernon. And who else was in the comments section other than Vernon himself? Yeah, the guy took to the comments of the blog post saying where he and Mary were that night. He claimed they were getting freaky in Mary's mom's car that night, and around 11 p.m. he was dropped back off in the area and said he saw 3 white guys near the scene acting suspicious. Of course, there's no way to tell if Vernon's story is true or not, but isn't that crazy that he literally hopped on the comment thread 50 years later to try and prove his innocence? Also, I feel like these 3 white guys would have been talked about in the case if they really were there. Another person in the comment section of the blog post was a woman who claimed to be Joy's friend. She said she invited Joy over for a slumber party that night, but her parents said no since they had church the following morning. Gosh, those tragic little details always get me in cases like this one. Mary and Vernon have since divorced, and the truth about their statements is still unknown. As of now, the case remains unsolved, and sadly, it might stay that way forever. Here's why. For starters, the crime scene wasn't properly closed off. About 1,000 nosy people walked through the house around the time of the crime, contaminating all sorts of evidence and making it impossible for detectives to figure out what fingerprints or shoe tracks were from the perp or just random visitors. Another reason this case remains cold is the lack of technology in the 60s. But some true crime junkies think the case could be solved if the evidence is reviewed with modern technology. The items used to restrain the victims probably have traces of DNA from the attacker or attackers. All 3 family members were tied up with household items like ties, socks, pantyhose, and other garments. Anytime someone pulls to tighten material like that for a knot, it's inevitable that their hands leave behind DNA unless they're wearing gloves. Other confusing elements about the case are the mixed reports of the victim's placement and wounds. While I gave you the most popular description of the crime scene, there are conflicting accounts. A lot of people still believe this was a crime spurred by sadism or it clearly wasn't for money. And it doesn't seem like it was for revenge based on the Sims' reputation. So the only logical theory is that someone or a group of people had some weird, inappropriate obsession and thought the Sims family was the perfect target. It's so sad to think about how many years have passed without seeing justice for this senseless crime. The community of Tallahassee is still shaken up about it, and what happened that fall day in 1966 will be ingrained in society forever. One of the Sims' neighbors, who still lives in the neighborhood, vividly remembers Joy coming to her door to sell Christmas cards, and one day later, Joy was gone. Wow, that really goes to show you how short life is. With that in mind, tell your family and friends you love them, lock your doors at night, and treat yourself to pie when you're craving something sweet. You deserve it. Thanks for watching.